Last time I spoke, we had 10 thoughts on the first half of the chapter, so this time we're going to have 10 thoughts on the second half of this chapter. Kind of where we split off last time and where we've come back to is quite a sharp contrast to begin with. So we finished last time at the end of verse 13, and at this point David is anointed and Saul rises up and goes to Ramah. And for the first half of the chapter we've been focusing on David and kind of the joyful scenes in Bethlehem. But then suddenly, as we start this week, we have a complete shift of scene and of tone. The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. So we're on to something quite different tonight. So again, we're just going to go through making 10 points in the passage in order, and hopefully we'll learn a few things. So in verse 13 and 14, verse 14 is what we just read. So it says, the Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul. And in the context of the chapter, as we've just said, it's quite a stark event. But as we go through the book of 1 Samuel, we've already had an incident of it, and we'll see it more as we go along. The Lord departing from Saul wasn't just a sudden event. It occurred over a period of time. So in chapter 15, verse 35, the end of the previous chapter, the Lord repents that he has made Saul king. And then in chapter 16, the Spirit departs. Chapter 18, the Spirit is not with Saul and is with David instead. And then in chapter 28, Saul himself acknowledges this. And there's little incidents in between those, but those are the four major ones that kind of show the progression. And I guess the lesson for us is that even if we do behave badly or lose faith like Saul did, the Lord is not going to abandon us straight away. It's going to be a long time that he will take to draw away from us. So the evil spirit from the Lord has troubled Saul, and Saul's servant said unto him, behold now, an evil spirit from God troubleth thee. So the servants have noticed this, which means we can probably guess that a kind of physical change and probably a behavioural change comes over Saul, and even to the extent that the servants actually mention it, because it's probably not the thing you would lightly broach with a king like Saul, who was liable to fly off the handle. So this is like a major event. But it's quite an interesting concept, this idea of the evil spirit from God, or from the Lord in verse 14. There's quite a few passages that talk about this idea. Sometimes it's presented as a evil spirit positively, or sometimes it's seen as kind of a benefit being taken away. But the exact nature of what is meant isn't obvious in the occurrences where such things happen, and it's not too important really. Like the main kind of interesting point, I think, is why evil spirits from God came upon people. So we've got a few verses on the screen. Sometimes they were to teach us about God. So we've got one in Isaiah 45, verses 5 to 8. Well-known passage. I am the Lord, and there is none else. There is no God beside me. I girded thee, though thou hast not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none beside me. I am the Lord, and there is none else. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Drop down, ye heavens from above, and in the skies pour down righteousness. Let the earth open, and let them bring forth salvation, and let righteousness spring up together. I, the Lord, have created it. So everything that happens is to teach us about God, to make peace, or as it says here, to create evil. And it's all to show us that he is the Lord and there is none else. And then 2 Corinthians is another passage in a similar vein. Chapter 12 and verse 7. Then again, this is a passage well known to us. "And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above all measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly therefore will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." So we have a contrast here between Paul, who received, you could call it an evil thing from the Lord, but yet he learnt the lesson. He learnt that his strength is made perfect in weakness. But Saul never learnt that lesson. He was proud until the end. And so we have the contrast between Saul and Paul. So sometimes these evil spirits or evil events happen to teach us about God, and sometimes it's not to teach us, but it's to teach other people through us. So there's a couple of these examples are in John. There's John chapter 9 verse 3. And this is chapter 9, about the man who was born blind. His disciples asked him, verse 2, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be manifest in him. I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And so this evil occurrence happened to this blind man, in part so that Jesus could be a light to the world, and so that other people could learn of the glory of God through Jesus. And there's a similar one in chapter 11 of John. This is Lazarus. Lord, behold, he whom thou lovest is sick. When Jesus heard that, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. So sometimes when we're in evil circumstances, it might not even be for us, for our benefit personally. It may be for the benefit of others, that they can learn from what is happening to us. And a third reason is for repentance. And this is a major thing with Saul, was these evil spirits came to try and teach him to be humble and to repent. And he half does, but he never fully gets all the way to being repentant. So there's hints of it, such as in 1 Samuel 24, around verse 16. In verse 17, he says to David, Thou art more righteous than I, for thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I have rewarded the evil. And thou hast showed this day how that thou hast dealt well with me, for as much as when the Lord hath delivered me into thine hands, thou couldest me not. So Saul wasn't always proud. He could recognise that other people were better than him. And chapter 6, verse 21. There's more of it in the context, but verse 21, I have sinned, return my son David, for I will no more do thee harm, because my soul was precious in thine eyes this day. So Saul, although he was proud, he could at times be humble, but he never fully learned from what God was trying to tell him in his life, to be completely repentant. And then we have verses in Matthew chapter 12, 43 to 45. When the unclean spirit is gone out of the man, he walketh through dry places, seeking rest, and findeth none. Then he saith, I will return into my house from whence I came out, and my ears come, and findeth it empty, swept and garnished. Then goeth he, and taketh himself 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter in and dwell there, and the last state of that man is worse than the first. So every time when Saul seems to be humble, or he seems to have learned a lesson, he never learns from it, he never particularly puts anything good in its place, and so it gets worse and a darker spirit comes upon him. So we learn to be humble and to repent when our life circumstances are telling us to be humble. So back to 1 Samuel again, carry on reading. verse 16. So this evil spirit is from God, is obvious to Saul's servants in verse 15. And they say, "Let our Lord now command thy servants, which are before thee, to seek out a man who is a cunning player on an harp. And it shall come to pass, when the evil spirit from God is upon thee, that he shall play with his hand, and thou shalt be well." It's kind of not directly mentioned in the text, but for a long time Saul had Samuel to rely on, to call on for advice. That we saw at the end of chapter 15, after the incident where Agag in chapter 15 and Saul kind of getting aggressive with Samuel. Samuel came no more to see Saul until the day of his death. So at this point, Saul, who is a proud man who didn't like to be humble, before he had Samuel, who was someone that he would at least talk to and recognise as worthy of listening to. But now he doesn't have anyone because of his own pride. And they're saying, like, you need someone to talk to, someone who can help you at least. And we see that David began to be and could have been that man. But it's just a sad situation that Samuel and Saul never see each other, because this whole time they're only a few miles apart from each other. But again, it's just Saul's pride has led to this. So the servants had said, "Seek out a man who is a cunning player on an harp." We had a bit about the harp last week. There's a man playing a harp. So the harp was probably a 10-ish stringed lyre, and sometimes was played using a plectrum. The interesting thing about Saul was that he was a musical chap, and it was a medium through which, when he was closest to God, this was the way that he communicated intimately with God. So when the Spirit came upon him, in chapter 10, in two different places in chapter 10, this was what he was. Saul was musical, and that's the way he talked to God, or prophesied. So chapter 5, this is what is told to do. "After that thou shalt come to the hill of God, where is the garrison of the Philistines. And it shall come to pass, when thou art come thither to the city, that thou shalt meet a company of prophets coming down from the high place, with a psaltery, a tabret, a pipe, and a harp before them, and they shall prophesy. And the Spirit of the Lord will come upon thee, and thou shalt prophesy with them, and shalt be turned into another man." And then in verse 10 and 11 this happens. So Saul was musical, and the music could have been used as a reminder of that time when he was close to God, and again an encouragement for him to turn back to when he was faithful. So the servants had this idea in chapter 16 of kind of play some music and then will help you be calm, which obviously works sometimes, but it wasn't exactly a solution to the problem. It was kind of a quick fix. There's a story about Charles IX after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where they killed all the Huguenots in his city, and for months after, apparently, he couldn't sleep, and he had like different string orchestras and stuff come to his room to try and make him sleep, but it never went away. He never slept again, and that's because there was a deeper problem in his life, was the guilt of all his massacres. And it's the same with Saul. He had a deeper problem, which he needed a spiritual problem, which he needed a spiritual fix for. So likewise, if we kind of sense that we might have a spiritual problem, we need to tackle it spiritually rather than just rely on other means. So the servants have made the suggestion, and in verse 17, Saul said unto his servants, "Provide me now a man that can play well, and bring him to me." This word "provide" is a very common word, ra, which means it's just to see. So see to it that this happens. And it's the same word as we saw in verse 1, for I have provided me a king. So we see in verse 17 the way that providence works is through the desires of men, and in verse 18 through the circumstances in our lives. So that's kind of the whole of our existence, if you will, is other people and our environment, and that means that God can work completely in everything around us. So Saul said this command, provide me a man. And then verse 18, then answered one of the servants and said, behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, that is cunning in playing, and a mighty valiant man, and a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him. So there's a big list of attributes of what David was known for. It's interesting to consider how the servant knows this, because you've got essentially two options. Either David was very well known by everyone, so everyone knew these characteristics, or alternatively, this servant knew David well personally, and we don't know which one it is, but possibly he knew him personally. So we have these characteristics of David. The first one listed, because it was most relevant to the situation, was that he is cunning in playing. I like to get mention of sheep in somewhere, but this one is that David, as we know, was a shepherd for most of his upbringing. And in those days, it's referred to in Genesis 40 about Jacob, is that kind of nowadays mainly shepherds come home for the night, but in those days they were away for weeks on end, and it could be really hot, it could be really cold, and it could be quite a miserable experience, which is why in Genesis Jacob said he deserved his reward because he put up with all this hardship in the service of Laban. But so to kind of alleviate the hardship of that life, they use various ways to get through it, and one of which is they would take a musical instrument out into the fields to entertain themselves, because it would be quite boring, and also to kind of calm the loneliness and such like. And it's also true, apparently, that sheep can be calmed by the right music. Apparently out in like the Middle East, where they have kind of ancient style shepherds, they play this music and the sheep seem calm. They've done studies and it does calm the sheep. So David was cunning in playing, probably from all the many, many hours he spent out in the field with nothing else to do. We also learn that he was a mighty and valiant man, which starting from chapter 17 onwards, we see is obviously true. And the third fact is that he was a man of war, which is interesting because we've just seen last time, we saw David being anointed as probably a teenager, and yet now he is a man of war, because the description mighty valiant man could just be from fighting the lions and bears and all that kind of stuff, but here we have him as a man of war, which means he must have been involved in the war, and so we can guess that there's a time gap between chapter 13 and chapter 14 in this chapter, verse 13 and 14 in this chapter, which may explain strange details later on in Samuel. The fourth characteristic is that David was prudent in matters, or prudent in word. So he's kind of wise speaker and also a good speaker. And if you're the eighth son of a family, they kind of say traditionally if you have a big family, the little one's the one that always gets like teased and is like the one who gets picked on all the time, and the last son always apparently tends to be a good talker to get out of those situations. So that may be partly from David's upbringing that he was the eighth son. And the last point we have in this list is that everyone knew that the Lord was with him. It's mentioned last, but it was the most important. And that's a shepherd out in the Middle East today, playing a strange instrument to calm his sheep. So the servant says this about the son of Jesse. So Saul sent messengers unto Jesse and said, Send me David thy son, which is with the sheep. And Jesse took an ass laden with bread and a bottle of wine and a kid, and sent them by David his son unto Saul. So this journey was probably about 10 miles. You have the ass laden with bread in verse 20, but you'll see in most of the AVs anyway, the word laden is in italics. The suggestion, it may or may not be true, is that the ass of bread, it could have been obviously a donkey with bread on it, or it could have been a measurement, as it was later for the Greeks, and they think possibly in earlier kind of nations, that it may have been a measurement, so rather than a literal thing, it was just the amount of bread that could be put on an ass. Probably then still to go on an ass, but either way. And again, in this we have a reminder back to the good times for Saul of chapter 10. So chapter 10 and verse 3 is the command to Saul, Go forward from thence, and thou shalt come to the plain of Tabor, and there shall meet thee there 3 men going up to God to Bethel, one carrying 3 kids, and another one carrying 3 loaves of bread, and another carrying a bottle of wine. So again we have a link back to a better time in Saul's life, which again he probably would have reminded him of that an occasion, and he could have used that as a spur to act more wisely. So verse 21, David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armour bearer. So Saul loved David greatly. It would seem they got on quite well straight away. But sometimes it might be better to love people less intensively, but for longer. Because sometimes you can like someone a lot, but then when it turns against you, you can react in a more extreme negative way because of the intensity of which you like them to begin with. So from 2 Samuel 18, we know that Joab had 10 armour bearers, because we tend to think of armour bearers as being a close personal friend of the king, because he was his man protecting him. But it's not necessarily the case that they were these kind of close friends, because Joab had 10 of them. So they would have been good friends, obviously, but not kind of best friends. And therefore, as well as it being from the working relationship, Saul would have loved, probably have loved David from his character as well as from their working friendship. So the focus in this little section has been more on Saul, but it's also interesting to note about David, and it's his first brush with royalty, and it showed him that kingship was a hard thing to take on, because he sees Saul, he's kind of depressed and he needs help. So it's not like David is being shown and offered kingship as this great thing. He's being shown it first as a struggle. So Saul loved him greatly, and Saul said to Jesse, Let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favour in my sight. And this was, obviously, because David was a great man, this would have been a good policy. But however, when we come to chapter 15 and onwards, it's obvious that this policy was not continued with, and David was sent home on multiple occasions. We looked at Psalm 78 last time, so we won't look at that again. So then we come to verse 23. It came to pass, when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took an harp and played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. So, although probably not in the way the servants had anticipated, or the degree to which anticipated it, it worked. Music is indeed a good idea in times of stress. I'll just finish with a suggestion, is that there's a possible contrast between the evil spirit which departed, which was from the Lord, and I could suggest, you can't prove it, that perhaps the Spirit of the Lord was inspiring David to play well. Because we looked last week at how the Spirit of the Lord remained on David from that day forward, which could mean any number of things, but that is one thing that it could possibly mean. And if that were to be the case, then it would show that the beneficence or the goodness of God is greater than the punishment that he has to mete out, and that God's mercy will win in the end, because if the theory is correct, then it would be the spirit of kindness in God overcoming his necessary discipline. So that's just a few thoughts on the end of 1 Samuel 16.